Hi everybody, today we're going to talk about frequency and relative frequency distributions in Excel. When dealing with a large amount of data, we need to use technology to help us organize the data. Today I'm going to use the desktop version of Excel to do the calculations. We'll look at the frequency function, AutoSum, pivot tables, and I'll use examples with both qualitative and quantitative data, so let's get started. As the first example, we are going to look at this data, which is the number of chicken nuggets in an order. So if you scroll through my data, you can see I have 25 data elements, and it tells me how many chicken nuggets were ordered, let's say at a fast food restaurant. So we can see the choices are 4, 6, 10, and 20. You can easily scroll through and see those numbers. If it was more than that, we would do something else, but we're trying to keep this simple. So over here, I'm going to say my choices are 4, 6, 10, and 20. And we'll say, again, number of chicken nuggets ordered. What we want Excel to do is to tell us the frequency, which is how often were each of these numbers ordered. So I'm going to highlight these 4 cells, and I'm going to type equals, and I'm typing frequency. This tells Excel to use this command. So I'm going to highlight all of the numbers, then I'm going to put in a comma, and then I will highlight 4, 6, and 10, which are what I want it to count. So I want to see how often 4, 6, 10, or 20 occur. I'm going to close my parenthesis, and then I'm going to hit Control, Shift, Enter, and it's going to fill in how many times people ordered 4 nuggets, 6 nuggets, 10 nuggets, or 20 nuggets. Let's do a quick check to make sure it got all of them. So under the frequency, I'm going to click this kind of sideways looking M, which means summation, and it's going to add up the 6, 7, 10, and 2, which says it comes out to 25, which is exactly how many orders I have. It shows 26 of the line because the first line was just a title. So now I can see the distribution. This would be my frequency distribution. If I want to do relative frequency, let's type here relative frequency. I need to divide each of the frequencies by the total of 25. To start, I'll put equals, then I'll click on the 6, and then I'm going to divide by, and I'll click the cell 25, which is our total. Now we have to make one small change here. Right now it gives me 0.24, but I want to be able to drag down, and there becomes a problem of divide by 0 because as I was dragging down, it was changing the cell reference for the total of 25. So to make sure that that doesn't change, when I click on the cell reference for the 25, the sum, I'm going to hit F4, which puts in these dollar signs, which tells it not to change this reference, to hold on to that 25 and use that as the denominator in all of the fractions. So let's put enter. This time, when I drag it down, I'm not going to get those weird things that say divide by 0 or some kind of caution. It gives me the answer, and again, let's click underneath and do the auto sum to make sure it adds up to 1 or 100. If you don't want your relative frequency as a decimal, you'll just highlight the numbers, right-click, and on the format cells, you want to say this is a percentage, and then decide how many decimal places you want, and I'm fine with 2. If you don't want the 2, go back, right-click again, go back to Format Cells, and then drop that down to 0 if you don't want to have those decimals. So now I quickly have a frequency distribution and a relative frequency distribution without me ever having to go through and count individual orders and try to organize that data. There's another way to do this in Excel that's really quick, and I want to show you that by looking at some qualitative data. So on this sheet, I have types of memberships for a gym, and there are 3 choices, basic, elite, and premium, and I can see that if I scroll through the data and see there's only those 3 types. So this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight my data, and I'm taking the time to show you that there are 50 elements in my data set this time, and I'm going to hit insert, and I'm selecting pivot table. It asks me if I want a new worksheet or existing worksheet, and I'm going to pick a new worksheet. I say OK, and here's my new worksheet. It only has one thing because I didn't have a lot in this table, and it says type of membership, so I'm going to click that. It tells me there were 3 types of membership: basic, elite, and premium. Awesome. Now I'm going to click it again and put it over in the sum. This tells it to tell me how many of each type of membership I had. So 15, 17, and 18, it looks like it's pretty evenly dispersed for this set. If I want to do a relative frequency distribution, I'm just going to take that type of membership, click it one more time to that sum of values, and right now it looks the same. I have the count of memberships, I have the count of memberships again. I'm going to right click and say show values as, and I'm going to say show me it as a percent of the column total. This turns it into relative frequency, which means it calculated 15 over 50, 17 over 50, and 18 over 50, and it's not surprising that the numbers are close together because we said that they would be when we were first looking at it. If you decide you want to change the title, like you don't like it to say row labels, you can just go in and say type of membership. And I can make the column bigger by double clicking. Here, I'm going to change this to frequency. And this other column, I'm going to change that title to relative frequency. And notice in the screen, it does tell you what it did on the backside. So it did count the values, but we got to skip all of that by using pivot tables, which are really my go-to anytime I'm working with Excel, especially when I have a lot of data values to get through. Again, if you don't like having these extra decimal places, you can right-click on the column. You can say Format Cells, go back to the percentage, and change that down to 0. We'll come back to these data values in another video and say how can we turn this from a relative frequency distribution and a frequency distribution into a chart so that we can visualize our data.